Good morning and welcome to the webinar, Preparing for your question and answer session. The reason I run this webinar is because as a public speaking coach and trainer, many people deliver great content. They're very engaging and they know their topic extremely well. And then they open up the session to questions and answers from the audience. And then what I see is that people struggle with the Q&A. They struggle responding to questions. They give poor answers. They don't answer the question. And what happens is all the good work, all that credibility, all that content starts to be diluted, starts to suffer as you poorly or struggle with answering a question. And what the audience says as they see you struggle with that question, maybe Peter doesn't know his stuff as well as I thought. Maybe he's not as across the issue that he's speaking about that I first thought. The question that Bill asked Peter was a really good question, and Peter didn't ask it all that well, or he didn't answer the question. So your question and answer session can be crucial in how well you're perceived, how well your content is accepted and taken up by the audience. So welcome to those of you who've just joined. We've only just got underway. So how to prepare for your Q&A session, how to nail your Q&A session. Participating in webinars, please ask questions as we go. You've got the little dialogue box. As soon as you type in the question box, I will see that you've written a question. Please take notes and think of a recent situation where you maybe haven't answered questions as well, or a session where you could have prepared better for your Q&A. What I want to cover today is just a brief introduction on Q&A, general tips for your question and answer session. What can you do to get ready? I'm going to teach you one model, the bucket model. In my workshop, Thinking and Speaking Off the Cuff, I teach several models for Q&A, for responding to questions. I've only got time on this webinar to teach you the bucket model and some strategies if you don't know the answer. So that's what we're going to cover. So in terms of an introduction, your preparation and your structure are two keys to Q&A. Now, the structure is really, think of your Q&A as a mini speech. What that means is when someone asks you a question, treat that question as a topic for a mini speech and do your normal beginning and your middle and the ending of your presentation. So put a structure in it. One of the mistakes that people do with Q&A is they do no structure. So they say stuff, they keep speaking and they talk, and then all of a sudden they stop. And we're meant to know that you've finished answering the question. So structure is really important within your Q&A. And the other thing that's really important, and it might seem a little bit of an oxymoron, but that is your preparation. And I know you don't know what questions you're going to be asked, but preparing and scanning the environment and anticipating is probably the key to your Q&A session. To nailing your questions, do your preparation. Structure is also important, but today I want to focus more on your preparation. So general tips to get ready for your Q&A, and this is part of your preparation. So first of all, who's in the audience? Who's going to be there? Are there any cultural nuances you need to be aware of so that when you answer, you don't come across so black and white, so pros and cons? You can adapt your answer because of who's in the room. Is your topic going to be something that's good news or bad news? If it's bad news, how are you going to handle those difficult questions? Those people who are not happy with the reduction in funding or the reduction in services or the downsizing or the restructuring. You kind of know what questions you're going to get. Walk in your audience's footsteps. So if you're an audience member and you were listening to yourself speak, what questions would you ask of that speaker? It's about doing a bit of scanning of the environment and working out what are the kinds of questions people are going to ask. Where does your data come from? If you're using statistics and someone challenges you, is it the Australian Bureau of Statistics? Is it the World Health Organization? The more preparation you do, the easier your Q&A session becomes. So many speakers go in, they prepare for their content, they have their beautiful PowerPoint slides, then the MC or the chairman or the speaker themselves says, are there any questions? And then they treat that as an off-the-cuff impromptu session and don't do any preparation, and sometimes get caught on the hop because they're not ready for that particular question. So preparation will hold you in really good stead. Set the rules up front. So when you're dealing with questions, let people know how you're going to handle questions. When I run a workshop, I up front in my introduction say, please ask questions at any time. When I run a webinar, I've said, please ask questions anytime. Type in the dialog box and I'll answer that question straight away, or I'll park that question for later on in the webinar if I'm going to cover it. Maybe you've got a whiteboard or a flip chart. So as you ask questions, I'm going to write them up on the flip chart or the whiteboard, and I'm going to deal with all the questions at the end. So with a one-day workshop, I can take questions as we go. If you're doing a short, sharp 30-minute breakout session or even a 30-minute keynote, can I suggest you set the rule, I'm not going to take questions as we go. Leave your questions to the end, towards the end, and I've got 5 minutes for Q&A. If you don't set that rule and someone asks you a question midway through, it could be that your content gets hijacked and you get taken off track trying to respond to questions that you don't have time for. So set the rules up front. Happy to take questions as we go. Please hold your questions towards the end. And when you do that, if someone puts their hand up and says, look, I've got a question, you can say, look, I did say in my introduction, please hold your questions to the end. So please hang on to that question. And you can move on back to your content. If you don't set the rule up front and someone asks you a question and you say, look, I don't want to answer that question now, can you hold that question till the end? That seems like you're being evasive, a little bit disrespectful. So by setting the rules of how you're going to manage your Q&A, people have a clear understanding. And you can then say, no, I'm not going to answer that because you've set the rule. The other thing that's really important, as well as setting the rules, is the scope. So by scope, I mean what you will talk about and what you won't talk about. So I'm here today to talk to you about the implementation of a new policy. So I'm going to talk about the logistics, the time frame, and what the implications are as we roll out this new policy. What I can't talk about is the financial side of things. I can't talk about how much this is going to cost you, the budget implications. If you have any questions around finance, you need to direct those or hang on to them and see the finance director. So really you're talking, setting the scope, I'm here to talk about this and I will not talk about this. So when someone midway through, depending on how you've set the rules, asks you a question, but Peter, that's going to cost a lot of money and my budget's already stretched. How am I going to deal with this new policy? You can say, look, I understand your frustration, but as I said in my introduction, I'm not here to talk about the financial implications or the budget. You need to go and sort that out with finance. Okay, let's move on. Are there any other questions? Once again, if I don't set the scope and someone asks me that question and I say, look, good question, but I don't want to talk about money. I don't want to talk about finance. I'm not here to talk about your budget. Once again, it seems like I'm being evasive or a little bit disrespectful. So one of the important things is to set the scope up front early. Introduce yourself, create early connection with your audience, and then say, so what I'm here to talk about is this. However, I'm not here to talk about this. If you do have any questions or concerns around budget, around finance, I'm not the person to talk to, and I won't be answering any questions around that. Of course, one thing that's really important, and maybe just taking it a step further, in your marketing material, in the email that goes out, in the meeting request, in your workshop flyer that goes out, make sure that the content describes accurately what you will talk about. So really in my email that goes out and you're at this meeting, it should be fairly clear that I'm not going to talk about dollars. Yeah, I've clearly pointed out the scope of what I'm going to talk about in my marketing material. So those people that are coming or are interested in dollars only probably won't turn up because they understand that that's outside of scope. So if people keep turning up asking questions or wanting you to explain stuff which is not your expertise, it could be that something's out of place in your marketing material. What is it that is leading people to come to your workshop, your seminar, to find out this when you're not here to talk about this? You're really here to talk about that. Are there any questions on that, setting the scope? Does setting the scope up front sound logical? And yes, it's about managing expectations. And yes, you're right, it can be used as a crafty way of avoiding contentious issues by, I guess, quarantining that from this particular seminar, this particular discussion. Okay, so it's what you will and what you will not talk about. That's what I mean by setting the scope. Anticipate tricky questions. I said in my introduction, are you delivering bad news? Are you downsizing, restructuring, reducing funding? Are you going to cause people to be angry in your content? And you will know that by stepping into their footsteps. If you're speaking to staff and you've probably risen through the ranks, when you were back on the floor, would have that information that you're now giving caused you concern? So I always ask myself these two questions when I'm presenting a new topic. What question do I not wish to be asked? Yep, I don't want to ask it. It's in scope. I'm not talking about outside of scope. It's in scope. And if that question is asked, what question would make me sweat or squirm in my boots? Then with those two questions in mind, it's quite important that we prepare an answer for both those questions, because someone will ask you those questions. You're hoping they won't. Oh, it's a touchy point. Prepare an answer. Someone's going to ask it. It's just good preparation. So anticipate those tricky questions, scan the environment, and have an answer prepared. Know your topic. Know your topic really well. Have depth and breadth. Know the past, know the future. I mentioned earlier on, where does your data come from? World Health Organization, Australian Bureau of Statistics. Know your topic really well, so you've got a little bit of background as well. One of the things I teach people to do in speaking is the art of telling the business story. And I get people to try and choose a story that's their story, their experience, their life, their struggle, their success, their overcoming adversity, a project they worked on that they brought back on track. Now, sometimes you will borrow stories or you'll read stories. There'll be fantastic stories. But when people come into Q&A, sometimes you don't know the background of that story when you borrow someone else's story. So with your content, it's really good to have depth and breadth. What's the history that brought it there? Where do you see the project or the topic? Where do you see the future? So know your topic inside out and do some reading around it. One of the things I advise people not to do, and I understand in the corporate world it's not always possible, but I advise you not to accept a set of PowerPoint slides from your HR manager the night before and the HR manager says, can you present this new policy for me tomorrow? And it's a HR policy and you kind of know a little bit about it, but that's going to be a difficult topic to present because you haven't had time to prepare and understand it. But even above that, it's going to be a really difficult topic to answer and respond to questions because you don't own it. So know your topic really well. Build a bank of frequently asked questions. I work with local government and sometimes their front desk, their front office staff take questions from their ratepayers. So you can imagine your own local government, your own city council, the types of questions that people in the community might ring up that one or two front office desk people. You've got a barking dog. You want to put in a rainwater tank. You want to put on a garage. There's a hole in the footpath. And these people are expected to know everything or not know everything so much as to what department they put people through. So I'm having a party on the weekend. Can I get some parking permits so that I have my friends park in the street where there's no parking? All of those things. So build a bank or a library of frequently asked questions that you have at your fingertips. So this is part of your preparation. The topic you're speaking on, what are those questions that keep coming up? Don't end with questions. So this is a general rule for Q&A. The reason is it's called the rule of recency. If you've been on one of my workshops, you'll understand that the last words I say at 9:30 will be the most recent words, and apparently they stick in your mind and you will remember. So they're memorable. If you close your presentation, you sum up, and then you open up to Q&A, and the last question is off field, a little bit contentious, then that could hijack your take-home message. So a real example, I used to talk on organ donation and transplantation. For the last 8 years of my 30-year career with the Health Department of WA, I managed Donate West, the organ donation agency, and I used to go and do talks at schools. And those of you who know me, and I think the picture on the first slide shows that I'm a man with no hair on my head. So imagine me doing a 30-minute presentation. I've finished beautifully. I've now got 15 minutes for Q&A. So Q&A is going really well. Then I've got one last question, and a young boy down the back puts his hand up and says, "Excuse me, mister, can you do a hair transplant? Can you transplant hair?" The whole class laughs. The school bell goes. 150 kids go back to the class. What's running through their mind? Gee, that was a funny question that Bill asked. That man up the front didn't know what to do. He turned bright red and was really embarrassed. And all of a sudden, that experience, that most recent event, becomes my unintentional take-home message. So what I say is leave room for questions. So I'm going to stop for a few minutes now. Are there any questions? Deal with the questions. In fact, that's a good question about hair transplant. As a matter of fact, you can do hair transplants, and in Malaysia, hair transplantation is the #1 form of transplantation that occurs. But I'm not here to talk about. What I want to talk about is organ donation that saves your lives, hearts, lungs, livers, etc. Then I go back. So no more questions, and I leave myself 2 or 3 minutes to end my take-home message. Are there any questions on not ending with questions? Someone says, what if there's an MC and he says, Peter's going to be speaking for 25 minutes and then I'm going to have 5 minutes for questions? This is what I say to people. Just make sure and remember the MC, or you need to remember, it's not the MC's gig, it's not the MC's presentation, it's not the MC's workshop, it's your workshop. So I'd say, no, this is the way I'll do it. I will speak for 20 minutes. I'll have 5 minutes for questions, then give me the microphone back and I need 5 minutes to sum up. That's one of the rules I have when I do keynote speaking and when I present. I don't end with questions. I always make sure I've got 1 or 2 minutes just to bring back to my core take-home message. So that's what I would do. Are there any more questions? Okay, moving on. Don't make it up. This is one of the rules. Honesty is always the best policy. You will get tricked every now and then. There will be something new. Someone's read a new journal article. Maybe the Canadians are doing something really innovative in terms of social housing, in terms of disability, that you haven't heard about. And they ask you that question. Don't make it up. Don't make your statistics or your data up. They can check on their smartphones. So just be aware, this is not the time to make it up. And I'm going to let you know in a short while, what do you do if you don't know the answer? It's okay not to know everything. And of course, one of the things, and I'm just jumping ahead a little bit, is our politicians. They take questions on notice. So they have 72 hours to find out the answer and get back to Parliament. So get back to them. 72 hours. So if you don't know the answer, get back to them. I think the secret of being a great leader is not knowing everything, but rather having open, honest communication and knowing where and how to get the answers. Who do you go to? So the front desk person who takes all the questions from the ratepayers in local government won't have all the answers, but will know whether to put you through to the building department, to the parking inspector, to the pound or the dog collector. And then one of the rules is to get back to the whole audience. So if one of you on the webinar asks me a question and my response is, look, I've got your email, let me find out and I'll send you an email. And the other 5 or 10 of you on the webinar say, but hang on, Peter, that's a good question. I want the answer as well. So I think it's important you get back to everyone. And in a conference setting, I would say something like that. That's a really good question. I don't have the answer. Let me find out, and I'll send your question and my answer to the conference organizer, and they can send it out to everyone who's registered for this conference. The other thing I can also do is say, look, that's a really good question. I don't have the answer at the moment. Let me find out and I'll post your question and the answers that I come up with on my website, on my homepage, and I'll leave it up there for about 2 weeks. So those of you who are interested in finding the answer to Bill's question, I'm going to put it on my website for 2 weeks. So that's about getting back to everyone, and I will reiterate that later on. All right. So just a summary, do your preparation. Set the rules up front, how you will handle your question. I'll take questions anytime. Please feel free to type them in the dialog box. Can you please hold your questions towards the end of the webinar, whatever those rules are for you? Can I have 1 question per person? So you've got a short, sharp session. You know you've got a couple of hecklers in the room. Can we agree up front and just have 1 question per person? And then when the person comes back with a second question, you can quickly shut them down. Set the scope. Anticipate tricky questions, know your topic, build your bank of frequently asked questions, don't end with questions, don't make it up. So they're the general tips. Are there any further questions? while I'm moving on to the model I was going to teach you, which is the bucket model. So the bucket model is simply or similar to frequently asked questions. And what it is you prepare scripted answers that kind of have a theme, and you have one theme for each bucket. This might be quality, this might be risk, this might be return on investment, this might be around safety. And when someone asks a question, you'll just get the crux, the essence of what they're talking about, and you'll bring out this beautiful question, this beautiful response to the question. Now, this model comes from Henry Kissinger, and what Henry Kissinger used to say was, what questions do you have for my answers? In other words, he's got a bucket list of 10 answers, and one of those answers will cover everything. So when he did his press conferences, as soon as he heard, he would say, okay, they're worried about, the safety of this. They're worried about return on investment. They're worried about the budget or the financial implications for this. And he'd bring out this beautiful, eloquent response to the question. Every now and then you'll get a question, as with the frequently asked questions, that you don't have an answer for. Someone's read something beautifully, you need to add a new bucket. My philosophy is it's okay to get caught out once, not knowing the answer to something, which is within your topic, within your scope, but it's a crime to get caught out a second time. So as long as you take that question on notice and build capacity, build a new bucket, then I think that's brilliant. So that's the bucket model, really quite simple. What questions have you got for my answers? Then the leaky bucket. What if you don't know the answer? Yes, you're going to build capacity, you're going to put a new bucket there, a new answer. You're going to add that to your list of frequently asked questions. So what do you do if you don't know the answer? Really quite a simple model. Don't bluff or make it up. They've got their smart device. Agree to find out. Our politicians take questions on notice. Let me find out and let me get back to you. Ask a colleague in the audience. That's a really interesting question. I haven't read that journal article from Canada. Does anyone else in the room have that answer? And that's throwing it out to the whole audience. I have a colleague in the room who focuses more on the financial side of things than the implementation side of things. Bill, do you kind of know what the cost implications are? And the broader audience, has anyone else in the room? So phone a friend. Phone a friend within the audience. Don't be afraid to phone a friend outside the audience. That's a really good question about juvenile diabetes. I only work in mature age onset diabetes. I've got a colleague who's a pediatrician and a colleague who's a pediatric endocrinologist. Let me ask them that question and get back to you. The question may be out of scope, in which case you say, look, I did point out up front, I'm not here to talk about that particular matter, but it's always good if you know who they should go to. But if you go to the Department of Treasury, if you go to the Minister for Finance, they should be able to answer that question for you, as opposed to shutting people down and leaving them high and dry. And of course, the follow-up and get back to them, get back to all of them. So that's what you do if you don't know. I think, as I said, the key to leadership is not knowing everything, but knowing where to find the answer and getting back to people in a good responsive time. One of the mistakes that people do from a general presentation perspective is they agree to follow up, they agree to find something out, they agree to let people have a copy of their slides, and then they don't follow up. That'll make your credibility suffer also. Add this question to the new bucket. So if you don't know the answer, don't have a leaky bucket, instead have a new bucket. Add that to your bucket model. And one of the things you do if you work in teams, share this new question, this new bucket with other people in your team. So not only have you built your capacity with new knowledge, you've also built capacity around your team or your organization. Okay. Are there any further questions? Any further questions? It's just gone 9:30, so I must follow my own advice. Just to let you know, I've recorded this webinar. If you want a copy of the slides or the recording, let me know. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me. I think the key to being a successful Q&A person is to do your preparation, follow some of those steps, anticipate tricky questions, who's in the room, set the scope of your audience, and also use a structure, whether it's the bucket model or whether you use beginning, middle, end, or whether you Google some other structure for effectively responding to questions. Just remember, you've done a great presentation. If you do a poor Q&A session, that could shoot bullets in your great presentation. You need to be good at doing your Q&A. So thanks for your participation. And I've got another webinar, I think next week, that you're probably aware of, and hopefully I'll speak to you then. But do your preparation and you can nail your Q&A session. Thank you.